This is the Dreamers Podcast, where dreamers share their stories to inspire you. Now, join host Joe Pardo as he interviews a dreamer who's living their dreams.
Welcome to the Dreamers Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Pardo, and today I'm interviewing Jared Easley, who is living his dream through podcasting evangelist, or through being a podcast evangelist. Welcome to the show, Jared.
Hi, Joe. I've been called a lot of things, so, I mean, sticks and stones, my friend. But, hey, it's an honor to be on your show, and, yeah, dude, I hope that everyone listening to this podcast, if they don't think of anything else, if they don't have any other takeaway, if they just keep hitting play on this podcast consistently, it's going to encourage them. It's going to give them new ideas. It's just going to open them up to new things. And that right there is a win. That is a step toward success. That's a step toward accomplishing a dream. So I hope that everyone will keep hitting play on your show. But I'm completely honored to be here. Thanks, man.
Thank you. I'm honored to have you on here. I mean, you're doing big things, and you're just in the infancy of your podcasting career. So why don't we get started by giving some background about yourself?
Well, thank you. My name is Jared, and I always introduce myself when I'm talking to females. I always say, my name is Jared, like the jewelry store. And there's a little song, "It Could Only Be Jared," and they sing it to me. And then they always ask me the question, because I'm married. I got a ring on my finger here, and they say, "Did you go to Jared's?" And the answer is no, I didn't. I don't think that I could have afforded Jared's at the time. Anyway, and when I introduce myself to guys, I always say my name is Jared, like the Subway guy, and most people know what that is. So, and then my last name's Easley, so then I'll say it's my last name's Easley to remember. So when I say those things, it's cheesy, but most people remember my name. And like you said, I've been podcasting for a little over a year. I've got over 100 episodes, and I would have never imagined the opportunities that would have opened up from just starting a podcast. But it's phenomenal the way podcasting can connect people. Just like tonight, Joe, you and I have just talked for a few minutes, but I have no doubt that you and I are going to become friends on Facebook, and we're going to connect. And that's just kind of the way this works. Is it's just a generous community, and lots of neat things are happening. But long story short is, I started a podcast, and now some cool little things are starting to develop from that simple thing of trying that out. And I don't have all the answers, but I'm learning a lot.
Yeah, it's amazing how quick you can come into something, especially something that requires so much technical background from so many different angles, whether it's marketing or it's talking or it's editing or having an eye for graphic arts, website development. That it's crazy how all these things can come together for one person.
Well, I appreciate you even mentioning that, because for those who are listening right now, I'm looking on a video on Skype. I can see Joe's studio setup, and he has quite the setup. It is a fantastic setup. I'm sure it was the opposite of inexpensive. I mean, this is probably an investment, a substantial investment that you've made into your equipment, and you sound amazing, and everything's awesome. And then there's me, and I'm fortunate to be a guest on your show, but I'm literally talking into a $40 Audio-Technica USB mic that's plugged into a PC, and it's not fancy, but it's worked for me. So that's the nice thing. You can really go all in podcasting and make this heavy investment, and that's worth it. And if you don't have the budget to do that, you can still do big things with a USB mic. So cool opportunities for everybody.
No, I mean, my setup specifically for podcasting was just the mic, the Blue Yeti. The arm and everything came after the fact, and I don't have to have the arm, but really it centers around the mic. And I mean, you sound great for a $40 USB mic.
I'll take it. No, I like your setup, man. I was just saying before we hit record that we have PodMove University, and I don't know if we're going to tell that story or not, but PodMove University, we're looking for podcasters who want to share their expertise. And I was telling Joe, man, I'd love to have you shoot a little video just explaining your setup, So, hey, maybe coming soon on PodMove University, you get to see Joe Pardo's studio.
Well, yeah, I would love to be a part of it.
Very cool.
So what would you say podcasting means to you?
Podcasting is, for anybody that's listening right now, you got the earbuds in, and that was me. It still is me. I think there's a lot of downtime that you can reclaim and you can learn something or you can have a laugh, whether it's being informed or entertained. Podcasting is great, and you got to reclaim that downtime if you're driving or if you're walking the dog or whatever you're doing. And so for me, podcasting is just opened up a whole new world. I've made a lot of amazing relationships through the connections, through interviews and things I've done on my show, through gracious people like yourself being willing to have a conversation with me. So I say podcasting, I think, is a movement. There is a conference called Podcast Movement, and it's in August in Dallas, Texas. And Joe, I don't know if you're going to be able to make it this year, but hopefully next year. But Podcast Movement is an event, and it's the first year. And it's just all these passionate podcasters coming together, wanting to take that skill and develop it further and continue to grow those connections and build their network and just make the world a better place through podcasting. And I think that's definitely possible. More and more people are getting into it, and we haven't seen anything yet.
Let's talk about Podcast Movement while we're on the topic. How did that get started?
Well, Podcast Movement, this is the first year. It hasn't even happened yet. It's going to happen in August of 2014 in Dallas, Texas. And basically, there was no podcast conference, which just blew my mind. There were events that had podcasting as a piece of the event, but nothing specific for podcasters by podcasters. And I remember being at an event called New Media Expo this past January, walking out of one of the podcasting sessions for the podcasting track, and I heard someone say in a conversation I was not a part of, "Why is there no podcasting conference?" And I remember hearing that and just saying, man, I've thought that for months. Why is there no podcast conference? And then the following day, came out of another session, completely different session, different person. I heard it again, someone else, completely different thing. Why isn't there a podcast conference? And I knew right then, Joe, it was like, okay, hello, that's the market. That I've listened to enough business podcasts to know that, you want to look for what the market wants, right? And I heard people saying it. I was thinking it. And right then it registered. Okay, if I don't do this, if I don't find a group and put this together, and there's a takeaway there, and I'll go over that in a second. But if I didn't act on that, I knew someone else would eventually, and I would be completely left out. And I just felt compelled to do it. So I knew I wouldn't be able to carry a task like this by myself. Like, this is a lot to do to put together an event. There's just a lot of crazy intricacies and angles and different things to consider. And I don't have that background in events. So I knew I needed to have other people to help me to make this work. Long story short, connected with a gentleman who put together PodCamp Dallas, which is just a regional pod camp. It's a one-day event once a year, and it had grown over the last few years. And his name's Gary. I went to Gary and asked, hey, Gary, could we potentially grow your PodCamp that you've put on into a national conference for podcasting? And he said, well, I'm interested in that, but I just don't want to try to take that on myself. Like, I could never manage that myself. And I was like, well, that's where I come in. And that's where, we're going to get some other people to come in. And we agreed on two other people. One gentleman's name is Dan Franks, who's just been a workhorse. He's been an all-star. He's a CPA, outstanding with WordPress and online business. He used to be a former professional wrestler, which I think is hilarious. And he's only 28 years old, which is like, dude, the guy is amazing. And then there's another gentleman named Mitch Todd, and the team, we got together, and then we're like, none of us have put on a conference. So, I mean, Gary had put on PodCamp, but that's like nothing compared to what we were dreaming for. And this is the power of podcasting, which we just alluded to earlier. Is I'd had an interview on my podcast, which is called Starve the Doubts, with a gentleman named Philip Taylor, who's the founder of FinCon. That's the Financial Bloggers Conference, and they've done several really big events that have been very profitable, that have been very successful. And I had Philip on my podcast as a guest. I was able to interview him and ask him questions and learn from him. And he was extremely generous. And that created a connection between Philip Taylor and I, or PT as they call him. So guess what? When I went back to PT and I said, hey, PT, can I have a phone call with you in this group? And can we ask you questions about if you were to start your conference all over again, what you would do differently? He graciously agreed to a 1 hour phone call with us at no charge, where we could ask him those questions. And we were able to completely learn from a pro, someone who does this, someone who knows what to avoid, what not to do, what to do. And we got all those answers. And once we knew those things, the next thing we had to do Joe, is we had to validate the idea, right? It doesn't make sense to just act on anything that you think of. You might have a dozen ideas, but just because you have the idea doesn't mean someone's going to buy that idea or pay for it. So now there's ways to do what's called marketing before you manufacture. And anybody that's interested in any kind of online business, this is a key thing to take away here. If you buy a airline ticket, you buy that airline ticket, you don't necessarily get on that plane right that moment, not always, right? So what's happened is the airline has sold you something before you did it. That's called marketing before you manufacture. There's ways to do that now where you can test ideas and you can see, are people going to pay for this or not? If they're going to pay for it, then you can create it, right? And that is completely ethical as long as you have integrity and you're going to follow through and do what you say you're going to do. Now, if you don't have integrity, I wouldn't suggest that you try that method. But we needed to validate the idea, Joe, so we went to Kickstarter. We did a campaign, and our goal was to raise $11,000, primarily to book a small conference center in a suburb of Dallas. We knew if we could get 11 grand over a period of 30 days, that was our validation. We knew, okay, we have enough money. It's not a lot, but it's enough money to put on a small podcast event that's bigger than just a regional event. We could call it the national conference. And then we went to friends. And this is funny, Joe. Anybody that is into online marketing or business, they'll know it's really important to have a big email list when you're trying to market to people. We didn't have an email list at all, Joe. We had nothing. We had friends who were podcasters, and we went to those friends. We said, hey, we're thinking about doing this event. Would you speak at the event? Would you attend the event? Would you support a Kickstarter campaign to put on this event? And all of them said yes. They shared it with their networks. We had several people. You and I talked before you hit the record button about a gentleman named John Lee Dumas from Entrepreneur on Fire. He was the first person with a good reputation, a real big reputation, that said yes to the podcast movement. That's something I'm never going to forget. That's just extremely generous of him to do that. And then, of course, as soon as John Lee Dumas was on board, a lot more people jumped in. There was just something about the John Lee Dumas effect that really helped our initial efforts. I mean, this was just a paragraph on an email at that moment. Nobody knew what this was. There was no fancy, I'm wearing the Podcast Movement t-shirt. Your listeners can't see this, but it's a really cool design and logo. And this didn't exist in January, right? So we just had to explain what it was, and enough people caught the vision, and we put on that Kickstarter campaign. And within 9 hours, Joe, we hit $11,000. And then fast forward to the end of the 30 days, we had over $30,000, so 300% of our goal. And now, as of today, 5 weeks away from the actual event, we've sold 550 tickets to an event that hasn't even happened yet, a complete idea of what if podcasters could come together, a national, now international conference, because we have people coming from Europe, from South America, and from Australia, which just blows my mind. What would happen if an event was created for podcasters, by podcasters, and therefore we have the podcast movement. And that's going to be, again, August 16th and 17th in Dallas, Texas. So if you're listening to this before then, come on out, podcastmovement.com.
Yeah, this show will be out before then.
Okay, fair enough.
So what would you say inspires you?
What inspires me is good people like yourself, Joe. I mean, it's not easy to do a podcast. It can be a lot of work. With the preparation, with show notes, with the recording, if you're doing your own audio editing, it can be a lot of work. So people who do this are either crazy or they just love it and they want to really provide value to people. In Joe's case, he loves it and wants to provide value. So that pumps me up, man, because that's cool. I dig that. And I want to help people like you, Joe, continue to take that message and spread that out. And that's why we do Podcast Movement. It's to give them an opportunity to connect with other podcasters, but also learn from some of the best podcasters out there. And even for that person who's aspiring to podcast, they can come to an event like Podcast Movement and they can learn a lot of really good stuff. So when they launch, they're ready to launch with a bang and do the best possible launch you can do for a podcast, other than just hitting a record and putting something in iTunes. And almost anybody can do that. But if you put some strategy into it and have a setup like Joe Pardo has in his awesome studio, man, you could be the next big thing. You could be the next Joe Pardo.
Whoa, now. Joe Pardo ain't even the next Joe Pardo yet.
Okay, fair enough.
But I gotta say, you do make me want to book that ticket from California to Dallas, even though I'll be in the middle of a vacation.
Well, that's okay. Vacation's a good thing too. And we mentioned this. There's a virtual ticket. So somebody that's listening to this saying, "Man, I'd love to go, but I can't." There is a virtual ticket that you could actually purchase the HD videos of all the sessions and view those after the fact. So if you can't make it, there's a virtual pass, and I'm sure that Joe will have a affiliate link, as he should, in the show notes where you can go check that out.
Yeah, definitely. So how did your dream of podcasting come about?
I was in a day job where I was successful and I had done all the right things, and I had won, the big bonus at the end of the year, and I was number one in my group and number one in billable time and all these categories that really nobody cares about. I think at the end of the day, Joe, I'd climbed this ladder and I realized I was on the wrong wall. And that was discouraging because I knew, man, I got to do something beyond just working at this particular job. There's nothing wrong with working a day job. That's totally cool. But at this point, I was not happy with where I was. And one of the things that happened based off of that frustration was it compelled me to start reading books, listening to audiobooks, and of course listening to podcasts. And in listening to podcasts, that's when I started to discover a lot of really good business podcasts. And that was interesting to me because entrepreneurship is something that I'm interested in. And I'm not pretending that I'm the most successful entrepreneur or that I've got it all together and that I'm hitting, six figures. I mean, I'm not doing those things yet, but I have started listening to these podcasts. And that fired me up. But that would have never happened had I not had that discontentment in that particular job. Just that period of my life, I knew, hey, there's got to be something beyond this. And what are some ways that I can fill my time and I can start expanding my mind and growing and thinking big and being responsible at the same time, being smart. And I found that podcasting was a great thing to fill my time. And for anybody listening, you're listening to this show because you realize this is an opportunity for you to continue to grow wiser and just take in some awesome content and keep hitting play on this podcast, like we said at the very beginning. And you'll be smarter and you'll get inspired. And it's going to open up an idea or a door that didn't exist 2 months ago or even, a week ago. And that's powerful. So I'm a huge fan of podcasting, and tell your friends.
Well, I really appreciate all the kind words about the show. It means a lot. How was your dream of podcasting? And I guess, did you leave your job?
Well, I left my job, but not voluntarily. I was let go due to budget cuts. There was about 10 of us that were let go, and it was, not anything I could do about it. Since then, I still do stuff on the side. I do contracting and consulting that has nothing to do with point of sale. I do point of sale contracting, but nothing to do with podcasting is what I meant to say. And, that's okay. That's what pays the bills. And I have a wife and a 3-year-old daughter. She's amazing. And a mortgage. So I got responsibilities. I get it. I understand. That said, though, there are some cool opportunities in the entrepreneur world. And right now, a lot of that is focused on podcasting. But we'll see where things go. Right now I'm pretty happy. I'm not working that 9 to 5. I am doing the consulting stuff, and that can be good and that can be crazy at times too. But I wouldn't have it any other way, man. I'm pretty happy right now, Joe.
Well, how was it received by your family when you decided to start podcasting?
My mom loved it because it's like I can, actually I don't have to pick up a phone and wait for Jared to actually call me back. Now she could actually listen to me. And then my wife, she jokes. Not so much she doesn't joke like this anymore, but in the beginning she called it my mistress because I was spending a lot of time podcasting, more than a husband probably should. So I've done a better job of having that family, home, work-life balance. But she gets it now. She sees the things that are happening with podcast movement, and she's pretty excited about the direction. But there are days, like any husband and wife and any family, put the mic down, put the phone away, no more podcasts. Let's actually be a family. And I'm so thankful for her. She balances me out, because I when I get into something, I really like it, and it'd be real easy for me to spend more time than I should on it. And I think that's why God allowed me to marry my wife, because she keeps me grounded in a good way. And she's actually going to be a podcast movement, so I'm excited about that.
That's awesome. So what steps did you take to get started once you decided that you want to do a podcast?
For me, I actually took a course, and I took a premium course that was really expensive. It was so expensive I couldn't even afford it in one payment. And I had to write to the gentleman, a guy named Cliff Ravenscraft, who's the podcast answer man, and just a testimony of his generosity. His course at the time was $800. And I knew, man, there's no way my wife is going to allow me to spend $800 on a podcasting course, like a hobby. Like, some people play golf and blow $800 over a course of several weeks or, a week or two. No big deal. But there's some budgets out there. Somebody's listening and saying, I don't have that in my budget. And I was one of those guys. So $800 was a pretty big commitment. And I wrote to Cliff, said, I really want to take this course. I believe in what you're doing. I love what you're sharing. And I believe I have the potential to be a decent podcaster, but I don't have $800. Could I split up the payments? And he was gracious to work out some kind of structure with me that we were able to agree on. And I took the course, and it was funny because right out of the gate, Cliff, who I absolutely love and respect, he says, if you're going to have a good podcast, you need to pull a Joe Pardo, and you need to have my elaborate studio package. By the way, here's my affiliate link. And it was like, man, $800 for this course to realize I got to spend now $1,000 or whatever it was. I'm throwing out a number. It may not have been that much for this really, nice studio package, because if I didn't have a good studio and good podcasting hardware, people might not enjoy the audio quality of my show. And that was discouraging, Joe. It was so discouraging. I didn't start a podcast for 9 months after that course. And the only thing that really changed the game for me is I found out about this $40 microphone, the Audio Technica. And when I found out about that, I was like, okay, there's really no more excuses for me. I need to start the podcast. And that's exactly what I did. I went to a conference. I met a bunch of the speakers there. I asked them if they'd be gracious enough to be guests on the show. Almost all of them said yes. Planned those interviews, did a bunch of them, and then I had a big stack of interviews that I was ready to launch in iTunes. And the rest is crazy, but that's what happened.
Yeah, I'm sure your wife wasn't happy when you were like, yeah, I spent $800, and it's been 9 months.
Yeah, well, she's pretty gracious and humble and
it's paying off.
Overly kind. It's starting to see some good things happen. Now I've had business come from podcasting where people have asked me to coach them or give them consulting. I've had affiliate sales. I've made money podcasting. I haven't made the money John Dumas makes, but I mean, I'm pretty happy with it. I mean, it's produced more than I paid in that course. And I mean, I'd say several times over. So I'm not rich off podcasting, but I've definitely made that money back and then some.
So what roadblocks did you hit along the way?
Oh, roadblocks. Everybody hits roadblocks. So if you're listening to this and you think, there's the perfect path, then you're just probably on something you don't need to be on, and stop spending money on that stuff. But that said, roadblocks are going to happen. And it's funny you bring that up because my show is called Starve the Doubts, and it's about overcoming self-doubt. And that's where I interview successful people and high achievers and ask them, hey, how'd you overcome self-doubt to get to the level that you're at? And it's fascinating to hear their stories. But, I've learned there's a good fear and a bad fear, right? So if you see that snake on that trail, that rattlesnake, you're not going to go near the snake because there's a possibility you're going to get bit. That's a good fear. That's a healthy fear. The Bible says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? It's good. It's okay to fear God. And then I think fear is something that can be good in the sense that it can say, hey, hold up. Are you prepared? Are you prepared for this outcome? Right. And if you can manage fear in that mindset, you can say, hey, it's okay to have the good fear. And then there's the nonsense, the stuff in your mind that's saying, I can't be the next Joe Pardo. I can't afford this fancy studio. I can't be cool and go to California on my vacation. Whatever your mind is telling you, don't believe that, because Joe's proof that this could be done. Right. So, I mean, I think when you have roadblocks, fail often, fail forward. There's all kinds of different quotes on that stuff, but the people that get up, pick themselves up, dust themselves up, and keep going, eventually, if you do that long enough, you will outlast the lucky and you will outwork the lazy. So I'm going to say that again. You'll outlast the lucky and you'll outwork the lazy. And that is the beginning of success.
So could you share a favorite memory?
A favorite memory, man. One time I was on this podcast with Joe Pardo, and I'm tearing up just thinking about it because it was so good. I love memories, man. Memories are great. I love music. Music always has nostalgia for me. And one of the questions I always ask at the beginning of every podcast episode I do on Starve the Doubts is I ask the guest, "What's the best concert that you've ever been to?" And it's just an icebreaker question, but it's really funny to hear someone like a Seth Godin, who's a New York Times bestselling author, multiple times, just has huge influence and huge impact. And, him talking about his favorite concert is a lot of fun. So I love concerts. I love music. And there's a band that I really love right now that I'd encourage anybody listening to check out. They're called Green River Ordinance. Green River Ordinance. And they had just put out a new album called The Collection. And it's acoustic, all their best hits, acoustic, unplugged version of those songs. And I've got that thing on constant play on my iPhone, and it just takes me back to the last several years, different moments in my life. And so I love that music. And I was laughing today. I was looking at my daughter. She's 3, and I was thinking about just a year ago how much she's grown in 1 year, and just the things she says and the things she does. And I spend as much time with her as possible. That's like my daily reset button. When I have those bumps like you described, and when I have those rough days, it's so nice to have a loving wife and a cute little 3-year-old daughter who likes to be with her daddy, just to bring that perspective. And yeah, man, always making new memories. I think that's a good way to live.
So is there any disappointments you've had with podcasting so far?
I think there's always disappointments depending on your frame of thinking or the way you're looking at things, your perspective, right? So I could be disappointed at a number of things right now, but I try to reframe what I'm thinking. And that's so critical to success in anything you do is how do you look at the situation? How are you looking at something? It's easy. Most people can complain and bitch and moan about something, but the people that seem to really take it to the next level and do big things are the people that don't sit there and focus on all the negative, but they reflect on that. They think, how can I overcome that? How can I move around that? So yeah, I get disappointed sometimes, but sometimes that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just life saying, hey, this is an opportunity for you to shift or pivot and take a new step in a different direction. So that's exactly what I try to do. But yeah, if you ever tell me the Joe Pardo show is being canceled, that would be a disappointment. I don't know how to overcome that one.
Yeah, me neither. So what do your dreams for the future look like?
Dreams for the future is Podcast Movement is in August. It's going to be awesome. And then we're going to do Podcast Movement potentially in other countries. So, we'll see. Right? Dream big, right? Writing a book right now. I want that to be an Amazon best-selling book. I want to eventually have a traditional published book, which is hilarious because I'm not really a I'm not going to let that stop me, right? I want to lose about 20 pounds. I know on the audio here I sound like I'm an Iron Man, and just keep thinking that and believing that. I want you to, because eventually I probably will be that Iron Man, but I'm not today. So that's an opportunity for me. And that's the future, man. Just continue loving my family and doing my best for them and providing as much value as I can and helping good people like Joe Pardo make good podcasts.
So is there any last thoughts you'd like to share?
The final thoughts is, if you're trying to get noticed online, be the noticer. People love it when you say their name. People love it when you mention them. So that's a big thing right now, is people trying to do online business, or they're trying to, build their social media following and things. I think the thing that works more than anything else is when you notice other people. So just pick 3 or 4 people that you like, that you respect what they're doing, that are not high up the ladder. They're kind of, maybe a little 1 step or 2 steps above you, and just start sharing their content or commenting on their blog, or every so often send them an email to just appreciate them. As long as it's authentic and genuine, you'll start to create a rapport with these people. If you can create that rapport, that has the opportunity to generate reciprocity, right? So these people who you're generous to are eventually going to say nice things about you, or they're going to share your podcast episode or whatever you're doing. And when you're by yourself, it's easy to get lost in the crowd. But when you build an army, it's really easy to notice the army, right? The army gets noticed. So the best way to build the army is to start by noticing other people. And as you notice other people and you're generous and authentic in doing that, that creates that rapport, which will then generate that reciprocity. And that's how you get noticed.
Would you like to plug all your websites?
My podcast is over at starvethedoubts.com. So if you want to listen to another podcast only after you've listened to Joe's latest episode, because that's priority. But after that, if you had time for one more, starvethedoubts.com. And then again, we mentioned it, and I think we should mention it again, podcastmovement.com. This is an event, even if you're not a podcaster, but you think, hey, that might be something for me. This is something you want to check out. And then let's say you're listening to this several months in advance and Podcast Movement's done. Guess what? There's podmove.com, podmov.com, and that is an online university for podcasters by podcasters, right? So all these expert podcasters are getting together, sharing their advice and their wisdom on podcasting of all types of levels of skill. And it's just a great place to come together and meet other podcasters online and also get a lot of really, really good advice on a variety of topics. podmov.com.
Yeah, I'll have all them on the show notes at howtodream.co.
Outstanding.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, Jared, to come on the show, and I hope that everybody goes and checks out Podcast Movement, because when I found out about it, I was pretty stoked about the idea until I found out that I'd be in California at the time. But I'm still looking and talking about leaving the trip early to come down.
Oh, man, please do. Yeah, we refuse to treat you like you treat us, Joe. Please come. Just kidding.
That's good to know. Well, I'd love to have you on the show again in about a year and follow up on how everything's been going for you.
Outstanding. I should be an Amazon #1 best-selling author, and we should have an event in a foreign country.
Well, don't forget about us.
All right, Joe. Yeah, plan your vacation in September next year, not August.
I will try. Thank you.
All right, my friend.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Dreamers Podcast. Follow us on Twitter at Dreamers Podcast. Join us on Facebook at facebook.com/Dreamers Podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the Dreamers Podcast, please send an email to j@jpar.co. This podcast is copyright 2014 by jpar.co.